They shot Bumpy 5 times in front of 40 people. 48 hours later, 2 men wished. They'd lived 5 bullets slammed into Bumpy Johnson, dropping him before 40 witnesses. The shooters thought it was an execution. They didn't realize they had just invited a retribution that would make them pray for the grave. Harlem has a rhythm. It is a heartbeat made of jazz, traffic, and the low hum of conversation. On this particular Tuesday night, Bumpy Johnson was the conductor. He stood outside the Palm Cafe, surrounded by his court. He wasn't hiding in a back room. He wasn't flanked by an army of bodyguards. He stood on the sidewalk, exposed, comfortable in the kingdom he had built. He wore a gray suit, tailored to perfection, a visual promise that order existed in a chaotic world. 40 people were there. Some were lieutenants, some were friends. Some were just neighbors, hoping to catch a nod from the man who made the rent stay low and the streets stay safe. They were the community layer, the insulation that was supposed to keep the cold world out. Then the rhythm broke. 2 men stepped out of the darkness. They didn't walk with the heavy, measured step of soldiers. They moved with the frantic, twitchy energy of men who were doing something they knew they shouldn't. They didn't declare a feud. They didn't demand respect. They violated the sanctity of the avenue. They raised their revolvers. 5 shots. Pop, 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 pop. The sound was flat and ugly. It tore through the conversation, shattering the peace of 125th Street. The crowd froze, their minds unable to process the sacrilege they were witnessing. 5 bullets slammed into Bumpy's chest and stomach. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of the neighborhood. Bumpy stumbled. He looked at the men, not with fear, but with a profound confusion. It was as if he couldn't understand the rudeness of it all. To shoot a man is one thing. To shoot the king in front of his people is an insult that blood alone cannot scrub away. He hit the pavement, the gray suit turning dark. The shooters ran. They sprinted away into the night, high on adrenaline, convinced they had just done the impossible. They thought they had killed a man. They didn't realize they had just tried to assassinate an institution. Harlem Hospital was not built to hold an army, but within 20 minutes of the shooting, that is exactly what it contained. The lobby was a sea of fedoras and overcoats. It wasn't just the criminal element. It was the grandmother from 116th Street, the shoeshine boy from the corner, the pastor from the AME church. They packed the corridors, a human wall standing between the outside world and the operating room. When the police arrived to take statements, they couldn't even get through the door. The community had closed ranks. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to guard the body. Inside the operating theater, the air was thick with the smell of iron and antiseptic. Doctors worked with frantic precision, their hands slick with the blood of the most powerful man in New York. 5 bullets, 1 in the liver, 1 in the lung, 3 scattered across the torso. By all medical logic, Bumpy Johnson should have been dead before his head hit the pavement. But Bumpy didn't operate on medical logic. He operated on will. As the surgeons cut and stitched, pulling lead from flesh, Bumpy's heart kept beating. It was a slow, stubborn rhythm. It was a refusal. Death stood in the corner of the room, waiting for an invitation, but Bumpy Johnson simply refused to sign the guest book. He held onto life with the same grip he used to hold onto Harlem, tight, possessive, and unyielding. Across town, in a dim basement apartment in the Bronx, the atmosphere was very different. The 2 shooters were celebrating. A bottle of cheap whiskey sat on a crate between them, already half empty. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and nervous sweat, but they mistook their anxiety for adrenaline. They were loud. They were boasting. "Did you see him fall?" The taller one laughed, pouring a jagged shot. "Folded like a cheap suit. The king is dead." We own the city now, the other replied, wiping his mouth. Tomorrow, we walk down Lenox, and everyone bows. They were already spending the reputation they thought they had earned. They were discussing which of Bumpy's rackets they would take over, which corners they would claim. They believed they had changed history with 5 pulls of a trigger. They believed the vacuum of power was theirs to fill. Then the phone on the wall rang. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the small room. The laughter died instantly. The tall one picked it up, a smirk still playing on his lips. He expected congratulations. He expected a reward. He listened for 3 seconds. The smirk fell off his face like it had been slapped away. His skin turned the color of old ash. He hung up the phone slowly. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. "What?" his partner asked, the whiskey suddenly tasting like vinegar. "What is it?" The tall one looked at the door, then at the window, suddenly realizing that the walls were very thin. "He's not dead." The words hung in the air, radioactive. "He's out of surgery," the tall one whispered, his voice trembling. "He's breathing." The celebration evaporated. The whiskey bottle was forgotten. In that instant, the 2 men realized the magnitude of their mistake. They hadn't killed a rival. They had just wounded a tiger and left the cage door wide open. They weren't kings. They were walking corpses. The first thing Bumpy Johnson felt was the fire in his chest. Every breath was a negotiation with pain. But as his eyes opened, adjusting to the stark white light of the hospital room, the pain was filed away. It was information, nothing more. A lieutenant stood by the window, watching the street below. He turned the moment Bumpy stirred. The man looked ready to burn the city down. He had a list of names in his pocket and a gun under his jacket. "We know where they are, Bumpy," the lieutenant said, his voice tight. "Give the word. We'll bring you their heads before the anesthesia wears off." Bumpy stared at the ceiling for a long moment. A lesser man would have screamed for blood. A lesser man would have demanded immediate, violent gratification to soothe his ego. "No," Bumpy rasped. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a gavel. "No," the lieutenant asked, confused. "They shot you, Bumpy, 5 times. If you kill them now," Bumpy said, forcing the air through his damaged lungs, "they die thinking they were soldiers. They die thinking they fought a war." He turned his head slowly to face his man. "I don't want them dead. Not yet. I want them to know they are already dead. I want them to wait for it." The order went out. It wasn't a call to arms. It was an excommunication. By noon the next day, the 2 shooters emerged from their basement hole. They were hungry. The whiskey had worn off, leaving them with trembling hands and a gnawing hollowness in their stomachs. They decided to risk a trip to a bodega on 145th Street, a place they had frequented for years, a place they thought was neutral ground. They walked in, heads down, collars up. The taller one grabbed a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. He threw a crumpled dollar bill on the counter. The owner, a man who had known them since they were children, didn't look at the money. He looked through them. He reached out and slowly slid the bread and milk back behind the counter. "Shop's closed," the owner said. "The door was open," the shooter argued, his voice rising. "Take the money." "Shop is closed." The owner didn't blink. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply denied their existence. The shooters backed out, confused. They went to a payphone to call their driver, the man supposed to get them out of the city. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. They tried a cousin in Queens, no answer. They tried a fence in Brooklyn, no answer. Panic began to set in. It wasn't the panic of being chased, it was the panic of being erased. They realized with terrifying clarity that the silence Bumpy had commanded was absolute. The phone lines were cut. The doors were locked. The money in their pockets was just colored paper. They retreated back to the basement, but the walls felt closer now. The shadows seemed to have teeth. They sat in the dark, listening to the street sounds above, the laughing, the driving, the living. They were just 10 feet below the sidewalk, but they were a million miles away from the world. Bumpy Johnson lay in his hospital bed, tubes in his arms, staring calmly at the wall. He didn't need to lift a finger. He had simply wound the clock, and now he was letting the ticking drive them mad. 36 hours. That's how long it had been since the shots rang out on 125th Street. In the basement apartment, time had stopped. The air had turned thick and sour, smelling of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of pure terror. The two shooters, who had felt like giants 2 days ago, were now reduced to trembling shadows. They hadn't eaten. The hunger was a dull ache in their bellies, but the thirst was worse. The tap in the kitchenette sputtered brown water, and they were too terrified to drink it. They were convinced it was poisoned. That was what paranoia did. It turned the mundane mechanics of life into potential assassins. The tall one, the one who had laughed about owning the city, was now huddled in the corner. He had his revolver in his lap, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. He was aiming at the door. He had been aiming at the door for 10 hours straight. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who knows that sleep is a death sentence. "They're coming," the younger partner whispered. He was pacing the small room 4 steps forward, 4 steps back, a caged animal. "Why haven't they kicked the door in? Why are they waiting?" "Shut up," the tall one hissed. "They don't know we're here. If they knew, we'd be dead." But they both knew that was a lie. The psychological pressure Bumpy Johnson was applying wasn't loud. It was the silence. It was the complete lack of engagement. If Bumpy's men had stormed the apartment, there would have been a shootout. There would have been noise, chaos, a chance to go out fighting like the gangsters they pretended to be. Instead, Bumpy gave them nothing. He left them alone with their own minds. He let the walls close in, inch by inch. At 3 a.m., the thirst became too much. The younger one couldn't take it. "I'm going out," he said, moving toward the window that looked out onto the alley level. "I'm getting to the car. We drive to Jersey. We disappear." "You're crazy," the tall one said, but he didn't stop him. He wanted to believe it was possible. The younger man climbed up on a crate and peered through the grime-encrusted window. The alley was dark, quiet. A single street lamp flickered at the end of the block, casting long, dancing shadows against the brickwork. He pushed the window open. It groaned, a sound that seemed to scream across the borough. He froze. Nothing happened. No shots, no shouting. Emboldened, he climbed out, his feet hitting the pavement softly. He took a breath of fresh air. It tasted like heaven compared to the rot of the basement. He signaled to his partner. "Clear." They moved down the alley, hugging the wall, guns drawn. They reached the street where they had stashed their getaway car, a nondescript Ford sedan. It was there. It looked untouched. Hope flared in their chests. They sprinted the last 10 feet, fumbling for keys. The tall one jammed the key into the door lock. It turned. He pulled the handle. The car didn't open. He pulled harder. Nothing. He looked closer. The door seams. They were wrong. He ran his finger along the gap between the door and the frame. It was smooth, welded. Someone had come in the night, silently, and welded the doors shut. They hadn't slashed the tires. They hadn't smashed the windows. They had sealed the car like a tomb. A noise made them spin around. Across the street, under the awning of a closed bakery, a single match flared. It lit up the face of a man in a trench coat, one of Bumpy's lieutenants. He wasn't holding a gun. He was lighting a cigarette. He took a drag, the cherry of the cigarette glowing bright orange in the darkness, and simply watched them. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just exhaled a cloud of smoke that drifted lazily toward them. Then, from the rooftop above, the click of a lighter. Then another from the alley entrance. 3 men, just watching. The message was clear. You are alive because we allow it. You are free because we haven't decided to catch you yet. The shooters didn't fire. They couldn't. The fear paralyzed their trigger fingers. They turned and ran, scrambling back into the alley, diving back through the window into their basement hole. They slammed it shut and piled crates against it. They were hyperventilating, backing away into the darkness. The car wasn't a getaway vehicle, it was a prop in a play, and the audience was laughing at them. There was no escape. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just put a hit out on them, he had turned the entire city into a prison cell, and the warden was in no rush. The end, when it finally came, didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with the turning of a lock. The door to the basement apartment opened. There was no shouting, no flash grenades, just 3 men in suits filling the doorway, blocking out the light. They didn't have guns drawn. They didn't need them. The shooters were huddled in the corner, smelling of urine and terror. They were broken. The 48 hours of silence had dissolved their nervous systems. When Bumpy's men stepped into the room, the shooters didn't reach for their weapons. The tall one actually wept. He wept with relief, believing that the bullet was finally coming to end the nightmare. They were dragged out, not roughly, but with the efficiency of sanitation workers removing trash. They were thrown into the back of a van. No hoods, no blindfolds. Bumpy wanted them to see exactly where they were going. The van drove 2 miles to an abandoned textile warehouse near the river. Inside, the space was cavernous, lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed gently in the draft. In the center of the pool of light sat Bumpy Johnson. He was in a wheelchair. His chest was heavily bandaged, visible under an open silk robe. An IV drip stand was next to him, the clear liquid counting out the seconds of his life. He looked pale, gaunt, and undeniably human. But his eyes were ancient. They were 2 black stones that absorbed the light. The shooters were thrown to their knees on the concrete. The tall one looked up, his face streaked with grime. "Just do it," he begged. His voice was cracked, desperate. "Please, just put one in my head." Bumpy looked at him. He didn't blink. The silence stretched out, agonizingly long, until the shooter began to shake uncontrollably. "You want the easy way," Bumpy said softly. His voice was weaker than usual, but it carried a terrifying gravity. "You want to go out like a soldier. You want a story that ends with a bang." Bumpy leaned forward, wincing slightly as his stitches pulled. "But you aren't soldiers. Soldiers have a code. You are just rude." Bumpy signaled to his men. "Strip them." The shooters froze. This wasn't the script. Gangsters killed gangsters. They didn't humiliate them. "Bumpy, please," the younger one started. "Every stitch of clothing," Bumpy commanded. It took less than a minute. The 2 men stood naked, shivering in the cold warehouse air, stripped of their weapons, their clothes, and their dignity. They looked small, pathetic. The myth of their power had been peeled away, leaving only trembling flesh. "If I kill you," Bumpy said, "you become a memory. Someone might even pour a drink for you one day. But this?" He looked them up and down with disgust. "You are going to walk out of here, naked. You are going to walk until you leave Harlem, and you are never going to come back." The tall one looked confused. "You're letting us go?" "I'm letting you leave," Bumpy corrected. "But you aren't going anywhere. I've made calls to Brooklyn, to Queens, to Jersey, to Philly. Everyone knows your faces. Everyone knows you shot Bumpy Johnson and missed. Everyone knows you're bad luck. Bumpy settled back into his chair, the pain evident but controlled. No one will hire you, no one will house you, no one will feed you. You are going to live, but you will wish you hadn't. You are going to wander this earth knowing that you are walking dead men, waiting for a permission slip that I will never sign. He waved his hand, dismissing them like a bad smell. Open the doors, let them run. The warehouse doors rolled up, revealing the cold night. The shooters stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the cruelty of the mercy. They looked at the guns of Bumpy's men, wishing they would fire, but the guns stayed holstered. Naked and shivering, the two men ran out into the darkness. They weren't running toward freedom. They were running into a world that had been turned against them, sentenced to a life of looking over their shoulder, praying for a bullet that Bumpy Johnson was too cruel to give them. It took 6 weeks for the cane to hit the pavement of 125th Street again. Click, click, click. The sound was new. It was heavier. But the man holding the cane was the same. Bumpy Johnson walked back to the exact spot outside the Palm Cafe where the 5 bullets had torn through him. He didn't avoid the spot. He didn't walk around it. He stood right on top of where his own blood had pooled, reclaiming the ground. The street went quiet. The people passing by stopped and stared. They weren't looking at a gangster anymore. They were looking at a revenant, a man who had looked death in the face and told it to wait its turn. As for the 2 men who pulled the triggers, they were never seen in New York again. Rumors floated in occasionally. Whispers of 2 homeless drifters in Philly, then D.C., looking over their shoulders, terrified of their own shadows. They were alive, but they were ghosts. Bumpy adjusted his coat, covering the thick knotted scars that now mapped his chest. He sat down at his usual table and ordered a coffee. He watched the avenue breathe, the rhythm returning to his baton. The lesson was etched into the concrete for every would-be challenger to see. You can hurt the flesh. You can break the bone. You can even stop the heart for a moment. But if you want to kill Bumpy Johnson, you need something stronger than lead. You have to kill the idea of him. And on 125th Street, that idea was bulletproof.